This is the slave narrative of Henry Box Brown. He was the slave who mailed himself to freedom. Henry was born in 1815 in Louisa County, Virginia, about 45 miles from Richmond. He was separated from his mother at 15, but remembers how loving and kind she was to him and his siblings. As a young child, Henry thought that his slave master was God and his slave master's son was Jesus Christ. Many of the young slaves thought the same, and the slave master never corrected them. It was Henry's mother who corrected him about this false notion of the slave master being God. Henry remembers working in a grain house when many other slaves passed by staring at Henry and his brother. The slaves had no shoes, no vests, no coats or hats, and said they never seen slaves dressed with those items. Henry and his brother noticed that they were hungry, so they divided their meat and their bread among the other slaves. The slaves were grateful because they said their master never gave them meat. Henry's brother began to question them and ask if they were married or went to church. Many of them said they were married, but they had to marry women on their plantation because their slave master would not let them marry women on other plantations. Consequently, they were all related to one another, and the master gave them a choice of marrying their family members or staying single. Henry's brother asked one of the slaves to show him his sisters. The slave said he could not distinguish between them since they were all his sisters. A slave marriage could be destroyed at any time, and a slave master would sleep with the wives of slaves and not hold himself accountable. Even the kindest slave master was known to rape his female slaves. The slaves at his plantation were never allowed to attend church, but they would secretly baptize each other at night while the slave master was asleep. When Henry and his brother left after working in the mill, they heard slaves screaming because they were being whipped since they were seen talking to Henry and his brother. At one time, the slave master's son, Charles, was so annoyed with the evils of slavery that he freed about 40 of his own slaves and paid for their expenses to a free state. Around the same time, Henry's slave master hired an overseer to help with the slaves on his plantation. The overseer was so cruel that many of the slaves thought about running away. The slave master was a mild-mannered man, so the slaves were shocked that the slave master allowed the overseer to treat them with such abuse and constant whippings. Soon afterwards, they realized that the slave master was dying. On his deathbed, he asked for Henry and his mother. Both of them ran to the slave master's bedside under the impression that he would free them before he died. Many slave masters would promise that if slaves worked hard for them, they would free the slaves once they died. However, it was usually a trick in order for the slaves to work extremely hard, and the slave master would end up selling them away from each other once he died. The same thing happened to Henry. Once Henry and his mother reached the slave master's bedside, they were told that Henry would make a good plowboy or a good gardener, and he has now been given to the slave master's son, William. Henry was told that he should never tell any lies. When his master died, he divided up his belongings equally among his four sons, William, Charles, Strawn, and John. By this time, Henry was about 15 years old. Henry, his sister Jane, and his mother all went to William. His sister Mary and her children went another way. His brother went to another plantation, and so did his other sister, Robinette. William took his sister Martha as his special miss. The slaveholders did not try and keep families together, but they divided them up by monetary value. The common expression was that slaves don't have any feelings. So his parents were left on the plantation, and he was taken away to the city of Richmond to work in a tobacco manufactory. The overseer there was named Gregory. He was a black man, which was uncommon for an overseer because overseers were usually white. Gregory was kind to his slaves, but when he died, a man named Stephen Bennett took his place. The slaves disliked him because he was a very mean man. Stephen Bennett had a wooden leg. He'd often try and sneak up behind the slaves to find out what they were talking about, but his wooden leg made so much noise that they often heard him before he appeared. Once he saw him tie a slave's hands behind his back and give him 100 lashes because he was 3 pounds short of his quota. Henry often saw him do other cruel things to the slaves. Despite this, the overseer was very well versed in religious studies. He used to say that if he were to die and go to hell, he'd have enough sense to fool Satan and get out. Eventually, he did die, and he was replaced with an overseer named Henry Bedman, the best overseer they ever had. He never cheated them nor whipped them. He was kind and would often ask the slaves to sing for him. Unfortunately, he died soon too after becoming the overseer and was replaced by one of the cruelest men. he had ever known, and his name was John F. Allen. The slaves were made to work 14 hours a day in the summer and 16 hours daily in the winter at the tobacco plant. The master liked John so much that no matter how cruel he was to his slaves, the master turned a blind eye. John would steal from the slaves and the master and would often brag about it. Henry felt that John was a demon in the flesh. There was a slave that would often sing while at work to pass the time. The man got sick and was bedridden for 2 or 3 days. The overseer didn't even realize the man was gone for a couple of days. John Allen, the overseer, had some slaves go and get the man and bring him to the factory. The sick man appeared, so feeble from disease or sickness that he could barely stand up. Rather than try to heal him, the overseer tied his hands behind his back and gave him 200 lashes. The man passed out while he was being lashed, which caused the overseer to finally stop whipping him. The poor man was sick for 4 weeks afterwards. Although John Allen considered himself a religious man, he used a lot of profanity and cursed often. This was not uncommon in the South among church members. Mr. Allen was superintendent of the Sunday school at his church. He would often tell the slave children to obey their masters and not lie and cheat, which is exactly what he would do outside of church. One day there was a heavy storm, and the sky grew so dark that the slaves could not see to work. Henry asked Allen if it was safe, and Allen said no, but he was hired to ensure that they work. Suddenly, lightning came close to where they were, and it scared Allen so bad that he jumped up, ran off, and hid. The storm was severe, and they later found out that a woman and child perished because of it. Allen said that a white man cannot be lost because, unlike the slaves, he had a soul. He said that since slaves had no souls, they could not go to heaven. In addition, the white man could do what he pleased, including lying and robbing the slaves, just as long as he went to church and read the Bible. Many of the slaves were beginning to run away to free states, so there was a plan that was devised to keep them from leaving. The whites promised to sell an old church building valued at $13,000 to the slaves for a sum of only $3,000. Their slaves agreed to this offer, combining their money together and putting every cent they had toward that church. Rather than saving for their escape or to buy their freedom, the slaves were trying to purchase the church so they'd have their own place to worship. But every time they paid off the church, they were always told there were more costs and more fees. They never got to own the church. A man named Reverend Ryland was chosen to preach to the Negroes. He was not picked by them or wanted by them. But in addition to him being picked to preach to them, they had to pay him $700 a year. It was clear that Ryland's agenda was on behalf of the slave masters, because he would often tell the slaves in his sermons to mind the masters and obey. Henry eventually fell in love with a slave named Nancy and wished to marry her. They were given permission to marry, and even though they had two different slave masters, Nancy's slave master, Mr. Lay, allowed Nancy to marry Henry and said that he didn't believe in selling family members away from each other, so Nancy would never be sold away from Henry. At the time, Nancy was often hired out to a man named Mr. Reeves. Mr. Reeves was a minister from the North who was known as a man who opposed slavery. However, Mr. Reeves wasn't in the South long when he began to write articles supporting slavery that appeared in the newspaper. Within 12 months of their marriage, his wife's slave master sold her to a man named Joseph H. Colquitt, a saddler, living in the city of Richmond. Mr. Colquitt was a harsh and cruel man, and his wife was even more cruel. She was very hard to please and often abused Henry's wife. Miss Colquitt said that Nancy was too refined to be a slave, and she often mistreated her because of it. Mrs. Colquitt got especially upset when Nancy gave birth and would nurse her baby. She hated Nancy so much that she made Mr. Colquitt sell her. However, when she realized all the hard work that Nancy performed for her, it was hard to do without her. So as a result, Mrs. Colquitt had her husband purchase Nancy back and had to pay an additional $50 more than what she was sold for. When Mr. Colquitt was on his deathbed and the doctor said there was nothing more that he could do, Mr. Colquitt asked for Henry to come to his plantation and visit him. He begged Henry to pray for him along with the other slaves that were in his field that belonged to the church. He wanted the Lord to spare his life. Although Henry knew he was a mean man and that he was abusive, he prayed for him anyway. After working in the field for the next 3 days, rather than resting, the slaves went to comfort Mr. Colquitt on his deathbed. Eventually, he did get better, even being able to sit up and enjoy meals with his family. Mrs. Colquitt, having been expelled from the church, despised religion and said that she does not believe in God or the devil. One day, Mrs. Colquitt began teasing Mr. Colquitt and said he had Negroes praying for him. Mr. Colquitt detested that he had ever had Negroes praying for him and said that if he asked them, it was because he was sick and out of his senses. As she continued to tease him, it made him so angry that he called his slaves out of the field and asked them which ones prayed for him when he was on his deathbed. The slaves that raised their hands were whipped for lying. He wanted to whip Henry too, but Henry did not belong to him. So to get back at Henry, he sold Nancy to Sam Cottrell. Sam was a saddler and had a shop in Richmond and went to Henry to tell him that Mr. Colquitt wanted to sell Nancy and their children to him. Mr. Cottrell said that he had enough money except for $50. Sometimes slaves would be able to work on the weekends for other masters to receive pay. So Mr. Cottrell asked Henry if he had $50 that he could borrow so that he could purchase his wife and children and keep them all together. He assured Henry that he would never sell her or the children away, and he would return his borrowed money. Although Henry did not trust him, he wanted to do everything in his power to try and keep his wife and children together. That same day, Mr. Cottrell came back to Henry and told him that he now owned his wife and children. They were his property. Henry would now have to furnish his wife and children with a house, provide everything they needed, and pay Mr. Cottrell a yearly fee of $75. He threatened Henry and said that if he could not do those things, he would sell his wife and children. Henry was so astonished that just earlier that same day, Mr. Cottrell appeared kind enough to manipulate him. Now he seemed like a totally different person. Being a slave, he could not rent a house, but he told his friend James C. A. Smith Jr. about his issue. And since James was a free man, he agreed to rent the house for Henry and put it in his name. Henry paid $72 per year in rent. So when Nancy's slave master, Mr. Cottrell, saw that Henry and his family were doing fairly well, he continued to rob them. He told Henry that instead of working for wages, Nancy was expected to wash his clothes. In addition, Mr. Cottrell continued to ask for money. One August morning in 1848, Mr. Cottrell demanded more money, but Henry told him that he did not have any more money to give. Henry and his wife hired themselves out for work, but still had to pay a sum to their slave masters. Mr. Cottrell said, "I want money, and money I will have," before he left. Henry hugged his wife and children, and with a heavy heart, he went to work. He had only been to work for a few hours when he was informed that his wife and children had been sold at an auction and were in jail until the next morning when they were to be taken to North Carolina. When Henry was able to leave work, he went and purchased some things for his wife and children. When he was on his way to jail to take it to them, a man told him that his wife's slave master told them lies about him at the jail. They would most likely seize him when he got there, and as a result, Henry had a friend take his wife and children the items and say goodbye on his behalf. The friend who went on his behalf was mistaken for him. He was beaten and thrown in jail until Henry's wife and children told the jailer that he was not the husband and father. Broken-hearted, Henry went to his master 3 times, begging him to purchase his wife and children, but his master refused, saying that Henry should just find another wife. As soon as Mr. Cottrell sold his wife and children, he raided their house and sold their belongings that cost Henry nearly $300 to purchase. Henry was able to purchase some of his articles back because the sheriff helped him after he paid the $17 debt that Mr. Cottrell owed to the sheriff. Henry heard that his family would be in the chain gang that would pass through in the morning, and if he stood on the street, he could possibly catch a glimpse of them. He heard his oldest child say, "Father, Father," and he was able to catch a view of his child. He soon saw the face of his wife, who looked like she was in agony. They were being marched with staples on their arms and ropes around their necks. He walked next to her for 4 miles, holding her hand. Neither of them said anything because their pain was too great. They knew that it was likely the last time they'd ever see each other in this life. Henry stopped going to church after they were sold because he no longer trusted the slave-dealing Christians. Henry didn't want to go to church around Christmas of 1848, but many people from church asked him to help them pick 24 pieces to sing for a concert since he was a leading member of the choir. Since his family had been sold away 5 months prior, Henry continued to try and find ways that he could gain his freedom. One day, while he was in the field working, his soul cried out to the Lord in a secret prayer. He asked the Lord to give him the freedom that had been stolen from him and prayed for the Lord to help him figure out a way to earn his freedom. Suddenly, the thought flashed in his mind to put himself in a box and have himself shipped to a free state, being conveyed as dry goods. Henry knew a storekeeper named Dr. Smith who believed that everyone should be free, including slaves. Dr. Smith agreed to help Henry with his plan if Henry agreed to pay him. Henry had $66 and agreed to pay Dr. Smith half of his savings. Although the storekeeper did not believe that Henry could lie in a box long enough to be shipped to Philadelphia, he was willing to help him anyway. In order to construct his plan, Henry was going to have to get permission to be away from work for a few days. Henry already had an injured finger and went to the overseer to show him his finger and request a few days off. The overseer said that Henry's finger was not bad enough to be absent from work, so Henry got Dr. Smith to obtain vitriol oil for him and poured a drop on his finger. However, in his haste, Henry put too much vitriol oil on his finger and it ate down to the bone. Henry went to the overseer again, and this time he was given permission to take a few days off to keep his finger well poulticed with flax meal until it got better. In the meantime, Dr. Smith had gained permission from a personal friend and was able to address the box to his friend. The next morning, he met with Dr. Smith in order to get the box ready for the express train. Henry created a box that was 3 feet 1 inch wide by 2 feet 6 inches high. On the morning of March 29, 1849, Henry got into the box. The box had 3 gimlet holes for oxygen to enter, and he provided himself with a small amount of water, both for drinking and wetting his face in case he felt faint. He kept the gimlet with him in case he needed to secretly poke more holes. His friends nailed the box shut, and he was taken to the express office, which was about a mile away. At times, Henry was placed upside down for hours, and although the position was extremely uncomfortable, he kept thinking about freedom and how it would be worth it. He felt a cold sweat coming over him at one point as his head was placed down, and he could feel his eyes swelling. Suddenly, a man complained that he had been standing for 2 hours and needed to sit, so he flipped Henry's box over and sat on it, relieving Henry of his agony and giving him relief. After being in the box for 27 hours and traveling more than 350 miles, Henry overheard someone say they were in the port in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a free state. It took Dr. Smith's friend a long time to come and get his box, but eventually, a wagon drove up and someone inquired about the box. When the box was finally taken to a residence, Henry still kept quiet as he did not know what was going on. He then heard a voice say they needed to open the box and see if Henry was still alive. Someone called to him and said, "Is it all right within?" And Henry replied, "All right." The men began to cheer and hastily opened the box. When Henry tried to stand, he became lightheaded and fainted. After he woke, he was welcomed and treated with kindness. Henry was so grateful that he began to sing hymns to the Lord. He was told that he should not remain in Philadelphia long, and he found himself in Massachusetts and then New York. Henry continued to travel around the North telling his story and advocating for the emancipation of enslaved African Americans. Thank you for telling your story, Uncle Henry. May you continue to rest in peace. If you like this slave narrative, please like, share, and subscribe for more content.